Now, in an interview this week, a BBC Radio 5 live presenter says an overwhelmingly white workforce has an impact on his mental health. Speaking to a journalism diversity conference, the presenter said that there are no Muslim workers involved in the senior editorial process at Radio 5 Live. Joining me now is the co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism for Equality and GBNews host and all-round good egg, Albie Amankona, and author and journalist, and equally also very good egg, journalist Rebecca Reid. Thank you very much for joining me. Now, this story has caused a bit of a fuss this week, hasn't it? So, racist workplaces. I'm going to come to you, Albie. What do you make of this story?
I found it to be really rather an odd story, actually, Dawn. First of all, the BBC is pretty known for being a relatively diverse broadcaster. If we look across their broadcasting networks, they've even got an entire BBC Asian network, which is one of the most popular radio stations in the country. And I don't really think it's credible to say, if you work at a company called the British Broadcasting Organisation, that you feel that you are mentally ill from working with people who are indigenously British. Now, imagine if you went to India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, you, a white person, Dawn, and went to work for the equivalent of the BBC in one of those countries and said, "Oh, my mental health is suffering because I'm working with so many South Asians." I think people would probably call you racist. So I can completely understand the people who were offended by the comments of this presenter.
So, yeah, Rebecca, that's a very good point, isn't it? I mean, why isn't it racist? Now, you know, the population of the United Kingdom is 87% white. Most of the employees, I think it's up to over 50% of BBC employees are ethnically diverse. So it's one of the most diverse places you can work in the UK, by the sounds of it. So, I mean, it does sound a little bit racist what he said, doesn't it?
I don't think it's racist. I think it's the same thing that you might find were you the only white person working in a Japanese radio station, that you might get to a point where you feel lonely and isolated because there's nobody who could talk about EastEnders. And you, for instance, perhaps at British traditional, not British, but, you know, Christian Easter might feel lonely and like you want nobody to go and have an Easter egg hunt with. I think what he was trying to say, and it's been taken out of context, it's been blown up, and it doesn't sound great if you read it outside of the full context. What he's trying to say is being different all the time feels really hard. I don't think he's saying the BBC is inherently a broken and evil organisation because of that. I think he's just reflecting on the ways in which it's hard to be the only one who is a certain religion or a certain ethnicity in an organisation.
I mean, you know, one of the quotes is the hardest thing is to walk into a room, look around and nobody looks like you. But, I mean, lots of people have to deal with that situation. Look, I'm not questioning somebody's mental health. If you say your mental health is affected, your mental health is affected. But, I mean, coming back to you, Albie, it's like, I understand why he's saying it, but it just doesn't sound like the most sensible thing to say. Albie?
Had phrased himself similar to how Rebecca had just phrased herself. I think a lot of people will be much more understanding with what he said, but that's not what he said. He specifically said that all the white people at his place of work were making him feel mentally ill. Now, I just think that's a pretty odd thing to say when you live in a majority white country and you work at an organisation which is actually probably one of the most diverse organisations in the country, according to the statistics that you just gave, and indeed has a whole radio station dedicated to British Asians, of which this presenter is part of that ethnic minority group. So I just thought it was a bit of an odd comment. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say if you are not from a majority group, you might feel left out in certain situations. That might be because you're working class, that might be because you're Asian, that might be because you're a Muslim. But if you make it about someone's race and you say, white people make me feel mentally ill, I can understand why white people feel upset about that comment.
Rebecca, let's put it the other way round. I mean, you know, if I, as a white person sitting here, said, you know, black people make me feel mentally ill, you can imagine the pile on that would get.
Yeah, and I think if you said that, well, you wouldn't say that because you're sensible, and you know that it wouldn't be a sensible thing to feel, and I doubt you would feel it. But what I've observed in some places where I've worked, where there's been one person in the team who is black or South Asian, is that in journalism particularly, there'll be a room full of white people, and whenever an issue comes up that is specific to people who aren't white, everyone goes, and looks at the person who isn't white. And again, I think the word microaggression gets a lot of flag, but I think you do find that there are lots of small ways in which people who are not white sometimes feel othered when they are in a minority. Now, and I think his specific example is that at the BBC you get a lot of people in an entry-level position who are not white, and you get a lot of people who are in sort of celebrity jobs, because God knows the BBC, like all media, likes to push forward people who are of a diverse background to try and make themselves look like they're being inclusive. But that middle strata of very well-paid professional roles tends to be exclusively white. And that's where some of the decision-making comes from, where, again, I think people end up feeling like their needs aren't being reflected. But again, I do understand that the way that he said it, particularly when it's taken out of context, does make it sound like he's just saying, I don't like white people. I don't think that is what he intended at all.
No, I don't actually think that was intended. It's just the way he said it wasn't the most, as you said yourself, Rebecca. But interesting, Albie, coming back to you. Rebecca is obviously a white woman, talking about how black people feel when they are the only person of colour in the room, and everyone goes, oh, yeah, looking at you, when it's like, right, OK, you can speak for your whole ethnic minority. Now, you are a person of colour. How do you feel about what Rebecca's just said there?
Look, I think lots of people of colour would have been in situations like that. I remember when I first started working in the city, the only other people that were working in my office who were black were all the cleaners. And I would be working late at nights, and then all of the black cleaners would come, and it would make me feel awful. So I can completely understand these situations. But I would never have said in that situation, Dawn or Rebecca, that being around white people all the time makes me feel mentally ill. It just strikes me as a pretty odd comment. I think there's probably ways that you can make that point better without offending people.
Rebecca, would you like to come back to that?
Reflecting one's experiences, and I think an equivalent is that I've worked in jobs when I was working as a temp and as a receptionist, where I'd be the only woman in a room, and when I walked in, the conversation would change, or there would be comments about women that I would find very uncomfortable. It does sort of happen if you're a woman in male-dominated industries. I wouldn't say that working around men made me feel mentally ill. I would say that some of the men I worked with were words I can't say on daytime television. And I think this is the problem, is that when you generalise, it does make people feel cross and hurt. And people who are cross and hurt aren't listening to a nuanced conversation about racism. They're feeling cross and hurt. So if you want to change anything, you need to think about how you structure your arguments and your sentences.
Lovely. Unfortunately, we've got to leave it there. Thank you both for joining us. Albie Amankona and Rebecca Reid. They're debating whether your workplace is racist. Now, we obviously have to see what the BBC have said about this. And their statement said, a journalism diversity conference, a BBC spokesman said, events like this one today are instrumental in bringing new talent in as we work towards making our organisation as inclusive as possible. We want everyone who works at the BBC and those considering a career with us to know we are focused on creating an inclusive culture where everyone feels they belong. We believe we should be setting the highest standards on diversity, and we recognise there is still more we could do. Therefore, we have clear plans in place to improve the diversity of the workforce. I would just humbly suggest there that they also need to start thinking about the class system there, and about how many working class people they employ there.